He's going to do one there in a sec.
Now put to me, please. And now to me. 750.
Now to me, please.
So, let me now introduce Ken Follett.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I love this book fair because there are thousands of people and we're all doing the same thing. We're all working our socks off to promote books and bring books to the public. We're all spending all this money, spending all this time to promote books, which I just think that's great. That's why I like coming here. First time I came here was 1976. However, enough about that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Century Trilogy and the latest book, which is Edge of Eternity. And my old friend Margarete von Schwarzkopf is here to translate if necessary. If anybody would like to ask me a question in German rather than English, then Margarete will happily translate for everybody. And if anybody doesn't understand my answers and would like a German translation of my answer, then you just have to ask. Margarete will do that. Other languages we may struggle with. We'll see.
French.
We can manage French. Okay. I'll tell you a little bit about why I wrote the Century Trilogy. I was asking myself, what is the most dramatic time in the history of the human race? And the answer, I think, is the 20th century. We had the First World War, which was the most terrible war that the human race had ever known. Then we had the Second World War, which was worse. Then we had the Cold War, which, if it had turned into a hot war, would have wiped us all out. So it's tremendously dramatic. And on top of that, it's our story. I was born in 1949. Everybody in this room was born in the 20th century. So the story of the 20th century is our story. It's about what we did and what our parents did and our grandparents did. And it tells us where we come from and how we come to be the kind of people we are. And what changes have taken place in the last 100 years? In 1940, there were only 3 democratic countries in the world. Every other country was ruled by a king or a Tsar, an emperor, or a Kaiser. And the 3 countries, United States, United Kingdom, and France, weren't very democratic. In the United Kingdom, working class men generally couldn't vote. In the United States, African Americans often could not vote. And in all 3 of those countries, women could not vote anywhere. What a change. Now everybody accepts that democracy is the best way to run a country. Now the idea that some group should be excluded from voting is considered outrageous. And that's not all. Think of the changes in the role of women that have taken place in the last 100 years. Even when I was a boy, I remember people saying very solemnly, in a marriage the man must be the master. And that's an attitude that will get you in trouble if you say it nowadays. Tremendous changes. I start with the history, because the history can't be changed. And I never violate history. I like to be able to say to readers, what you read of history in my novels will be true history. It'll be accurate. And I go to a lot of trouble with experts checking my work to make sure that it is accurate. I start with the history, but of course, my readers don't want to read a history book. They want to read a novel. So history has to be transformed into fiction. And the way that's done is by making those great historical events, the Berlin Wall, the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassinations, making all those tremendous historical events part of the everyday lives of a group of fictional characters. Because that's what we want as readers. We want to get involved in the lives, in the destinies of the fictional characters. I've tried to tell the story of the 20th century through the lives of 5 families. You might say, why families? There are quite a lot of characters in fiction who don't have families. James Bond is a great example, isn't he? James Bond has no family. There's no mother and father, has no kids. He has a different girlfriend in every book, of course. and he is probably the most enduring fictional character of the 20th century. But for me, it's better if a character is part of a family. And I'll tell you why. When in Edge of Eternity, one of my characters living in East Berlin decides to escape and cross the Berlin Wall, I want the reader to be anxious about her. Now, it was very dangerous. Tragically, many people were killed escaping across the Berlin Wall. More than 200 people were killed escaping across the Berlin Wall. So we know that she's in terrible danger when she does this. But also, she's surrounded by people who are worried about her. She's got a mother who says, is this going to be all right? You might get killed. She's got a brother who says, how are you going to do it? It's very dangerous. And for me, that heightens the feeling of anxiety that the reader has about what this character is going to do. So for me, the experience of the novel, I think, is heightened if the principal characters are part of a family that loves them. So that's why I tell the story of the 20th century through 5 families. It's also 3 generations. Fall of Giants, the first generation. Winter of the World has as its principal characters the children of the characters in Fall of Giants, and Edge of Eternity features the grandchildren. And I've done that because one of the most important things in our lives is how our kids turn out. You ask people what's the most important thing in your life, what's the most important thing to make you happy, you might get a lot of answers. People might say career, money, love, sex, but a lot of people would say, well, I can only be happy if my kids are happy. And so in the trilogy, we see how the second generation of children turns out, and also the third generation. And I very much enjoyed that aspect of writing the trilogy, and I'm hoping that readers are enjoying it as well. It's taken me 7 years. It's about 1 million words. The 3 books add up to about 1 million words. And I was very anxious about it when I began. I announced that I was going to write this trilogy, but I was a little worried because nobody had done this before. Nobody's ever tried to tell the story of a whole century in the form of 3 novels. And I wasn't sure that I could do it or anybody could do it. So I did have a kind of nightmare in the back of my mind where we had a press conference like this and I said to everybody, it's been a failure and I can't write it and I'm giving the money back to my publisher. Worst nightmare of all, giving the money back to the publisher. And I'm very, very happy that didn't happen and that readers have loved these stories and that the trilogy has also been a very big commercial success as well. Well, now I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have about the Century Trilogy or any of my books or, within reason, anything else.
How mindful were you at the 20th anniversary before the Berlin Wall in terms of the timing of this book coming out? And what is it about the events of this peaceful revolution that still captures the imagination even beyond Germany?
I wasn't mindful at all, I'm afraid, of the 25th anniversary. I didn't realise, it didn't strike me until about a year ago when I was discussing the promotion of the book with my German publishers, Lübbe Verlag, and they said, did you know there's going to be a really, really big party in Berlin on the 9th of November next year? So that was a happy coincidence. But I think the significance of the fall of the wall, I mean, you used the phrase a peaceful revolution, and that's true. But of course, the wall was the symbol of the divided world. And it's obviously the central symbol of Edge of Eternity, because Edge of Eternity is about the Cold War. And the war, of course, was a personal tragedy for many German families, but it was also an international symbol of a divided world and of the fact that the 2 warring camps, the United States and the Soviet Union and their allies, were head-to-head, and that on any day war might break out and we might all be wiped out. So although I quite agree with you, the wall finally fell in a peaceful revolution, it was in its way a very violent symbol.
Could you use the microphone? if that's possible. It's a long way around.
Do you remember where you were personally during the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Yes, I was sitting in my house in London watching TV during the fall of Berlin. And the interesting thing is that we didn't really believe it. When we saw all those images on TV, and most of us in the UK were saying, yes, but tomorrow the tanks will roll in, because we had seen that so many times before in Prague and in Budapest and in Warsaw. We had seen we'd seen the Soviet Union regain its power very aggressively and very cruelly, and we thought that was going to happen again in history. The only people who really understood were Germans. Germans, I think, knew that this was the end of communism, but the rest of us kind of hoped it might be, but we didn't really believe it.
Next question. I would like to put a question in between because I was fascinated by this film. And I know, Ken, that you're a great man to do research. So how much did this research mean to you personally? Because you seem to be very touched by this research. How difficult is it sometimes to do your work for a book?
Well, I must say, I was taken by surprise on that bus trip by how emotional the whole thing was, because I thought I knew most of this stuff. And after all, I lived through the civil rights era, and I was old enough to read the newspapers, and I knew what was going on. But actually to go to those places and to stand in those locations where in the 60s people were beaten and thrown in jail and murdered sometimes, people who were scorned and jeered at, those people are now heroes, like John Lewis. There are statues of all these people on the streets of cities in the south where those people were beaten. There are now statues of them. And the sort of, and I suppose what made me feel it so deeply was actually the optimism of the whole experience. The fact that that battle was fought and won. The good guys won. It's kind of, I think that's what sort of brought tears to my eyes. All that cruelty, all that violence, but in the end the good guys won. So yes, it was a surprisingly moving trip. I might also say that I don't often spend 3 days on a bus nowadays.
Next question, please. And please, if you could use the microphones.
The story of the 20th century has been told now. What are your plans now?
Well, I finished Edge of Eternity at Christmas, and since then I've been working on a new story. I'm going to write another story based in Kingsbridge, which is the fictional town where The Pillars of the Earth takes place, and World Without End. So it would be the third book about Kingsbridge. It's set in the 16th century, and much of the drama is about spies and secret agents in the 16th century. So it's kind of a mixture of the kind of thrillers that I used to write with the historical novels that I write now. I don't have a title for it yet. If anybody can think of a good title for a 16th century spy story, I'd be very grateful to hear about it.
Is it the time of Henry VIII, or is it later under when the Armada?
Elizabeth I.
Ah, so it's...
Elizabeth I, reign of Elizabeth I.
It's going to look forward to.
The international press corps is not normally this shy.
So please speak up.
We do also have someone coming in online.
Yes,
Yes, we do have questions coming in online.
Thank you. By your research, you visited, like you said before, a lot of tragic points of time or history. What was the most fascinating, if it could be tragic or happiest point in the whole history you write about for you personal? What touched you mostly?
Well, I identified very strongly with the Welsh family in Fall of Giants. In the first chapter of Fall of Giants, Billy, who's 13 years old, begins work as a coal miner at the age of 13 on his birthday. He goes underground, goes down the pit, as they say. That's the expression in Wales, going down the pit. I felt that very strongly for two reasons. One, because I can remember what I was like at the age of 13, and I can imagine how frightened I would have been at that age to go down a coal mine and be expected to work in with a group of men, strong men, quite not kind men. First of all, I can imagine what a terrifying experience that must have been for a 13-year-old boy. And secondly, my grandfather did it. My grandfather, Arthur Evans, at the age of 13, started work as a coal miner. He lived in Mountain Ash, which is the real-life Welsh town that is the basis for Aberowen in Fall of Giants. Although there are 50 identical towns in the South Wales coalfield. And that story, I was told as a boy, your grandfather went down the pit at the age of 13. He didn't talk about it much in the way that I have found that people who have been through harrowing experiences are often reluctant to talk about it when they're older. So my grandfather never talked about it much, but the story was told again and again in my family. So I identified that, and probably when I thought of writing that chapter, that was probably when I really decided to write Fall of Giants, when I really decided the book could be done. A question here?
Yes.
Without all of us.
You'll bring it. No microphone.
It's coming.
Thanks a lot.
Why did you plan a trilogy and not an open end? I think last year's, for example, September 11, are so full of story or historic stuff, or even nowadays about the Islamic movement. Why did you terminate yourself to make a trilogy with a special, determined end? Why did you give yourself the chance to extend to a quadrilogy, for example?
Well, there's something about a trilogy that satisfies my artistic need for neatness. I don't really like open-ended artistic projects. However, of course, I'm not actually banned from writing another book in the series. I used to be very friendly with Douglas Adams, the late Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And the fifth Hitchhiker book was described by Douglas as the fifth book in the increasingly inaccurately named Hitchhiker trilogy. And so, of course, I could. But the other problem, actually, I'm often asked, what about more recent events, particularly in the Middle East? And the problem, from a literary point of view, is that I don't know what the resolution is. And in a novel, there has to be a resolution. In real life, of course, there isn't always a resolution. And that's why we prefer literature to real life. So it's very difficult to think of a novel about things like 9/11 and Al-Qaeda and the Middle East. It's difficult to think of a novel because you can't think of the ending.
We have this lady now. And the question is if there are any plans to turn this book or these books into film, and if Ken would take another small part in it.
The answer is yes. While I was writing the trilogy, I was approached several times by television producers, but I said I wouldn't negotiate for the rights until I'd finished. So I finished Edge of Eternity at Christmas, and my Hollywood agent immediately began those negotiations. We had 6 television producers interested, which was very nice, very flattering. We eventually made a deal with Sony, and Sony have since partnered with ABC, the American Television Network. So Sony and ABC are developing the trilogy as a television series. The producer is Mike DeLuca, who produced a movie called Captain Phillips quite recently, and before that a movie called The Social Network, which is about Facebook. I'm very happy, he's a very distinguished producer, I'm very happy that he wants to make this as a television show. And what's happening right now is that the script is being written by a Hollywood scriptwriter called Anne Peacock. And we're hoping that the first season might be shown in February 2016. That's a rather optimistic schedule, but that's what they're saying. So it's all looking very good. Margareta's going to have to translate all of that.
But will you play a small part?
Will I play a part? Well,
Welsh minor or whatever.
well, you know, I haven't asked them yet, because at this stage of development is not the time for me to start pushing myself forward as an actor. But later, if I get a chance, of course I would love to be in it. I was in The Pillars of the Earth. It was a most interesting experience. I was on screen for 15 seconds. It took all day to film those 15. And that, by the way, wasn't because I was a bad actor. That's normal. 15 seconds of television takes all day to film. So it was a most interesting experience, and I was privileged to work with real actors who were really good. The scene was shot in Budapest, and it was about a family sitting around a table for lunch in France, and the family was distinguished by the fact that most of them had red hair. So the room was full of Hungarian extras with red hair, none of whom had ever met any of the others before, none of whom spoke English. So it was kind of a fun experience. Margareta, you have to translate all.
Ich glaube, die meisten haben es verstanden. Filmpläne, Fernsehpläne sind, und wir hoffen alle sehr, dass Ken vielleicht diesmal die Hauptrolle spielt. Nein, Quatsch, dass er wieder eine kleine Rolle spielt. Auf jeden Fall hat es ihm sehr viel Spaß gemacht, die Rolle, die er schon gespielt hat. Und wir werden mal sehen, 2016 soll die Serie angeblich starten, der erste Teil. Wir wissen alle, das sind immer hohe Pläne, aber vielleicht haben wir Glück und 2016 kommt der erste Teil der Verfilmung. Wir haben, glaube ich, noch eine Frage von Ihnen.
Genau, wir haben noch eine Frage zu den Genres, in denen Herr Follet schreibt. Können Sie sich vorstellen, auch mal einen ganz anderen Genre mal ein Buch zu schreiben, also nicht im historischen, auch nicht im Thriller-Genre, sondern mal in eine ganz andere Richtung zu gehen vielleicht?
The question is if Ken could imagine to write a completely different genre, not a thriller, not a historical novel, but a love story. But it's always love in your books. But could you imagine to write something completely different?
No, I don't think I'm going to write something completely different. I reinvented myself once when I wrote The Pillars of the Earth. After 10 years of writing thrillers, I wrote a long historical novel, which many people said was a really stupid thing to do, because people expected something different from me, but actually it was very successful. Pillars of the Earth, still my most successful book. But I'm not planning to reinvent myself again. I mean, it was very difficult to write The Pillars of the Earth because it was a different genre. And I was able to do it because I was driven by my fascination with those great churches, with the great cathedrals of medieval Europe. I can't imagine anything else that would keep me going if I had to learn another new genre. People sometimes say to me, why don't you write a play? Because people know that I love the theatre so much. The reason I don't write a play is I'm sure it will take me 5 years to figure out how to write a good play. If I could do it at all, of course, which is no guarantee. And I just, at this point in my life, don't want to spend 5 years learning a new skill.
Also, wie gesagt, die Frage war ja, ob er sich in einem ganz anderen Genre wiederfinden würde. Nein, denn immerhin ist damals mit Säulen der Erde, hat er sich ja neu erfunden. Nach sehr vielen sehr erfolgreichen Thrillern hat er dann diesen großen historischen Roman geschrieben und schreibt nun historischen Roman und Thriller oder gemischt, wie wir ja hören bei dem nächsten geplanten Buch von Kingsbury. Aber sozusagen auch ein Theaterstück zu schreiben, was ihm öfters vorgeschlagen wurde, das würde für ihn 5 Jahre kosten und diese Jahre will er lieber mit was anderem füllen. Also können Sie die Antwort geben, nein, es bleibt bei diesen Genres. Und eine letzte Frage.
Eine letzte Frage habe ich noch. Was lesen Sie denn selbst gerne? Lesen Sie auch gerne historische Romane und Thriller oder vielleicht als privat auch was ganz anderes? Was ist denn so Ihr Lieblingsbuch beispielsweise?
The question is, what does Ken Follett read? What is his favorite author or his favorite book?
Right now I'm reading a novel by a Spanish author whose name is Grandes, Almudena Grandes, and it's a novel about a big family, which I like, and it also takes place in the present, but the family has a history during the Spanish Civil War which influences the present. I'm enjoying it enormously. It's a very good novel, very successful, called The Frozen Heart in English. I don't know what it's called in Spanish. Generally, that's the kind of book I like. I like long novels. I like novels about families. I read a lot of 19th century fiction. I enjoy the classic French and English writers of the 19th century, Balzac, Zola, Flaubert, and Dickens, and George Eliot, and Jane Austen. These are the authors I like. Of course, this is the tradition that I write in. There's nothing 20th century about my books. They're not modern. They are very much the typical 19th century novel with characters and a plot and a resolution. And happily for me, that is also the kind of novel that most readers like, and that's the kind of novel that always gets into the bestseller list. So I'm a traditionalist, but so are the readers.
Die 8. bis 19. Jahrhundert Lieblingsautoren und er fühlt sich ja selber in dieser Tradition stehen, denn eigentlich ist seine Literatur, mein Ken Follett, nicht 20. Jahrhundert mit Experimenten, würde man mal sagen, sondern eine klar strukturierte Erzählweise mit Personen und so weiter, einer richtigen Handlung. Aber die Leser lieben das.
We have...
Yeah, there's a question.
Yes, Mr. Moment. Yeah, thank you. Can you explain us what research you did in Berlin or about Berlin to write about this part of history, and why it was so important for you to write about Berlin Wall in the fall of the war?
The main thing I did here was to walk around and look at the places where people used to cross the wall. Because in those escape scenes, which are the sort of action moments in the story, the details, the physical details are terribly important. So I wanted to look at all of those places. I was already familiar with Berlin as a city. The other important aspect of my research is that after I've written the first draft, I have people check what I've written and look for mistakes. And for this aspect, I was helped by a friend who is actually with us this morning, called Angela Spitzig, who I've been working with for many years. And Angela and also her mother read my first drafts and tell me if I've done something that just wouldn't happen in Germany. Or something that German people wouldn't do, or they wouldn't eat, or they wouldn't wear. It's because I'm writing about different nationalities, it's very easy to make a mistake of that kind, and it's very helpful to have somebody who's willing to read what I've written and make those little corrections. And Angela was born in the former East, and she and her family escaped to the West. And so she is familiar with a lot of the background to Edge of Eternity, although she also read the first 2 books in the trilogy and helped me with that as well. And I have several people who do that kind of thing in other countries as well.
And why was it so important for you to write about this part of history?
Well, the book is about the Cold War, and Berlin is at the heart of the Cold War. And the division of Berlin is so symbolic of the division of the world. So both symbolically and in practice, I mean, a lot of the drama took place right here, starting actually before Edge of Eternity, starting with the Berlin Airlift in 1947, 48. So it's not merely my choice. Berlin is very important and very central to the history of our civilization in the 20th century.
One last question from me. When we spoke about miscounted trilogy number of books, is there, of course, there's different and very not so easy to calculate what the future brings. But you ever thought about to write about the history of the families? Go to your other genre. So speaking of the family in Europe before they go to the States or before they started in your first book.
Well, that's a good idea. Thank you.
That was from George Lucas before, sorry.
A prequel?
Yeah.
Yes, that might be quite interesting actually. The story of these 5 families actually up until the beginning of the 20th century. Oh.
I take 5%.
That's going to be interesting.
Excellent. Well, okay. Thank you for that idea. I like that idea. I might do that.
But when you wrote the book, did you sort of have a biography for each character, so which could sort of enable you to go back to, let's say, the Middle Ages with each family?
Well, there is a little bit, no, not back to the Middle Ages. I'm not likely to live long enough to do that. But there is some, yes, for example, Billy's mother is Italian. So there could be the story of the Italian family that came to South Wales, which many Italian families did actually, came to South Wales to work in the coal mines. Although being Italian and being smarter than Welsh people, they soon left the coal mines and opened restaurants. So in South Wales, when I was a boy, all the coffee shops in South Wales were called things like Bracchi and Fulgoni, because they were all run by Italians. Very odd. Anyway, so there we are. We're writing a novel here. This is great. You're contributing. Anybody else got
10%. Over 10%.
Should we...
one last question. Yes,
one last question.
Yes.
Ultimate question.
Yes, here.
Yes.
Okay. You take many of your ideas from research. And how often does it happen that research is changing your storyline or your plannings?
Well, the research does not often change the storyline. What happens is that something comes up in the research which means that I can't do the scene that I wanted to do. For some reason it's impossible. I'll give you an example. In Edge of Eternity, there's the family in East Berlin owns a business in West Berlin. And so I had the accountant cross into East Berlin every week to talk about the business to the boss. Now I was told that couldn't happen because German nationals could not go from West Berlin to East Berlin. That's the kind of problem that arises all the time, and it's not difficult to find a way around it. The answer in that case was to make the accountant Danish, because foreign nationals could cross. That's a very simple example. Sometimes there are much more difficult problems, but generally speaking, I find a way to do the same scene, but with different background. I did, in the research of Edge of Eternity, change my mind. I changed my opinions about quite a lot of political issues. In the 70s, I hated Nixon, President Nixon, and everybody I knew hated President Nixon. And during the research, I realized that before the Watergate scandal, Nixon did a lot of good things. Nixon brought the troops home from Vietnam. He integrated the American schools. And he started the Environmental Protection Agency, which is still the lead agency in the United States for the environment. And of course, he completely changed world politics when he went to China. And so I realized that actually, if it had not been for Watergate, we would now think of Nixon as a great president. And that surprised me.
Well, thank you very much, everyone coming here and asking questions or thinking about asking questions. I hope you got all the answers you need for writing articles or whatever. Thank you, Ken Follett, coming here. Thank you, Barbara, for introducing. And I think we're all interested to see the other 2 films as well that we are hanging around our net. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sabine?
Hello, Fabian. Hello. you very much.
Only your name, please.
Ernst.
Ich suche mal die Seite.
Mehr Kollektion auf Autograph.